the case that Aaron was just telling you about very quickly that I argued back in 2004, when the coverage of that case came out in the Ottawa Citizen at the time, I was described as the young Ottawa lawyer who argued that case. And that's almost a decade ago. I don't get described like that anymore. But that's okay. A little age is, in this profession actually doesn't hurt. The case was about, well, it was a domestic violence. The charges that the accused in that case were facing were domestic violence charges. But the aspect of the case that is pertinent to what we're talking about tonight is the way in which this person's pretrial detention, the time that he'd spent in custody both prior to trial and then throughout his trial, had been calculated and ultimately credited in terms of his sentence. And just to put it in a nutshell, this was somebody who had a bit of a physical disability, a difficult time walking. He had a bit of a lame leg, needed a cane to walk. He was not permitted to use that in the facility because it was something that, in the view of the staff, could potentially have been a weapon, might have been a danger to himself or others in the institution. Ultimately, he ended up being housed for a very lengthy period of time in the hospital wing, the medical wing of the detention center. And at that time, this was a unit that, with 4 beds, I believe, that was intended to house 8 people, up to 8 inmates. When he was, he spent some time in the hospital, was released, and then when he ended up going back into custody, was actually sleeping on the floor in the medical wing, in the hospital wing. And what it ended up being determined was that his classification in the hospital wasn't so much for medical reasons as it was for reasons of convenience. What's important to know is that back in 2003, the practice in Ontario, and in fact across the country, was to award 2-for-1 credit for time spent in pretrial detention. The reasons for that were to recognize a number of things. One, the harsher conditions in remand facilities than in federal prisons, and even in jails meant to house inmates serving provincial sentences. 2, the fact that you don't get earned remission when you're serving pretrial custody or pre-sentence custody. So once you're sentenced, you're released at 2/3. It's called earned remission or your statutory release date. You don't get that when you're serving pretrial detention, so the 2-for-1 credit was intended to compensate for that. When the government passed the Truth in Sentencing Act in 2010, that effectively eradicated the option of awarding 2-for-1 credit. It legislated that pretrial credit be credited at on only a 1-for-1 basis, so effectively stripping people of the earned remission that they otherwise would earn as of the date of sentence for their pretrial credit, and said that in no circumstances can a judge award more than 1.5 days to one, and then only when the circumstances justify it. I'm not going to get into the types of circumstances that may justify it, but suffice it to say that they're rare. One of the problems that has led to the enormous overcrowding in the provincial jail system, and just to clarify one little point, prison, that side of the equation, everyone seemed to be correct. That's meant to describe a federal institution where you serve a sentence of 2 years or more. A jail, you can be sentenced to jail. People in jail are serving sentences all the time. Jail is simply meant to describe a sentence of less than 2 years, in other words, a provincial institution, such as the Ottawa-Carleton Detention Centre, although that's more of a remand facility than it is a jail. But in the early part of the last decade, there were many jail closures. The Cornwall jail closed in 2002. The Pembroke jail closed in 2004. Burrett's Rapids near Kemptville was shut down. All of these jails that used to house several inmates going to court in those various jurisdictions, when they closed, had the effect of rerouting all of these inmates to the Ottawa-Carleton Detention Centre. So you've got this one remand facility intended to house about 326 inmates, at times statistically shown to be housing as many as 550 inmates. So if you're going to court in Pembroke, you're being taken down 2 hours west down Highway 17 to court every day, in an OPP paddy wagon. Now tell me how that economically makes any sense, as opposed to having a jail to serve that region. The situation, look, this isn't an us and them scenario. The overcrowding affects everybody in the jail system, whether you're an inmate, whether you're a staff member. I'm a criminal lawyer, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I advocate for a living. I can argue one side of an equation persuasively and I think convincingly, but that's not what this is about. I'm not in front of a judge or a jury right now. When jails are overcrowded, when there's triple bunking in cells that are in 8 by 8 foot cells that are, you know, not big enough to accommodate 2 people, but they're designed for 2. When you have 3 people with 1 sleeping on the floor, a jail is going to become a powder keg. And when you have people working in that environment, it's going to lead to more incidents of violence, more aggression, more problems. I frankly don't see it myself as a huge political issue. I know that you'll have talking heads from, you know, various political stripes saying that if you elect this party or that candidate, we're going to get the increased funding that we need to make our institutions humane. Don't buy into it. Don't believe it. There's no political candidate that's going to run a campaign based on better treatment of prisoners in our detention centers. It's a social issue. It's got to come from the grassroots, and it's got to come from people like you. You've got to lobby whatever government happens to be in power at the time for increased funding, because it's a community issue. You have to make it clear that we're not going to tolerate less than humane and acceptable conditions in our jails. It's too easy to simply say, it's not my problem. The last thing I want to say is this. One of the nearly half, there are 29 jails in this province, and nearly half of them, according to Ministry of Corrections statistics provincially, earlier this year, were said to be overcrowded. So that just gives you an idea of the chronic problem that's going on. It's not only centralized locally here in Ottawa, it's across the province, it's across the board. The Central East Correctional Centre in Lindsay, that was built not too long ago, was meant to compensate for a lot of the jail closures that were going on around the province. Earlier this year, because there was shoddy construction in that building to begin with, there were substantial repairs needed, so they couldn't use, I think, about a quarter of the facility or something along those lines. That became overcrowded. So the jail that was meant to be the dumping ground, because of overcrowded, was itself becoming overcrowded. When Kingston Pen closed, you probably remember the outcries. Suddenly, inmates were shoved kicking and screaming onto airplanes, being flown out to other facilities, other penitentiaries across the country, because they could no longer obviously be in Kingston. This had the effect of taking away from their loved ones, their friends, their families, you know, to other provinces. Imagine somebody, as Aaron said, presumed innocent, serving pretrial custody, not found guilty of anything yet. 18 years old, 20 years old, parents, friends, loved ones, girlfriends, families, right here in Ottawa, being shipped off over 3 hours away to Lindsay, sometimes for 2-3 months or more, awaiting trial, still presumed innocent, can't meet their lawyer face-to-face, can't see their families face-to-face. There's a problem, and we as a community have to address it. Thank you.